Princess Arya stood in the grand hall of the Crystal Palace and her father the king was speaking. But she heard only the silence because 3 days ago the human broadcasts had stopped, and the entire galaxy felt the absence like a missing heartbeat. And nobody spoke of it directly, but everyone knew what silence from Earth meant. The tall windows of Sylvanmere showed 3 moons rising over silver forests, and in the courtyard below her 2 dragons played and chased each other through fountains that sparkled with starlight, because Ember, the smaller golden dragon, loved to splash water at Storm, who was twice her size and patient as ancient stone Arya had bonded with the dragons when she was only 12 summers old, and it was rare for Elven royalty to bond with dragons because dragons chose their companions and could not be commanded. And her father had been furious at first, but even he could not break a dragon bond once it formed. Now she was 23 summers and the dragons were her closest friends and her only confidants because she could not tell anyone else about her secret collection of human things and human stories, because elves were taught that humans were dangerous and unpredictable and violent. But Arya had studied them for years and found them beautiful in ways her people could not understand. She had music files that made her cry and books that made her laugh, and recordings of human children singing songs about hope and stars and dreams, and she had watched videos of humans dancing and creating art, and exploring their world with wonder that reminded her of how dragons looked at new things with bright, curious eyes. The council meeting ended, and nobles filed out in their flowing robes and serious faces, and they whispered about trade routes and security, and the power vacuum that Earth's silence would create because humanity had been small in number but large in influence, and they had rejected the Galactic Council's rules 3 times and sent their own ships wherever they wished and fought off anyone who tried to control them. Arya slipped away to her chambers and locked the door and pulled out her hidden data pad because she had been tracking every piece of information about Earth for the past 3 days, and what she found made her hands shake with something between fear and excitement. The human ships were gone, and every single one, and the colonies were empty, and the space stations were abandoned, and it was not an invasion because there was no damage, and it was not a plague because there were no bodies, and it was not a retreat because they had taken everything, including their pets and their plants and their art. Her door chimed, and she quickly hid the data pad as her handmaiden Lucy entered with evening tea, and Lucy was human and one of only 5 humans who lived in Sylvanmere, and she had been with the Ryas family since before Arya was born. Lucy set down the tea with shaking hands, and Arya saw that the older woman's eyes were red from crying, and without thinking, Arya hugged her, and Lucy held her tight and whispered, "They left us behind. Princess, and the ones who stayed, said they were not strong enough for the journey." Arya pulled back and gripped Lucy's shoulders and asked what journey and where did they go, and Lucy smiled through tears and said somewhere the council cannot follow, and somewhere they can be free, and they left messages for anyone brave enough to search. That night Arya could not sleep, and she stood on her balcony and watched Storm and Ember sleeping in the courtyard below, and their scales glowed softly in the moonlight, and she thought about humans sailing into unknown space, and about how dragons always flew toward new horizons, instead of away from danger. She made her decision as the 3rd moon set because she was a princess, but she was also bonded to dragons, and dragon riders did not hide in crystal palaces, while others faced the void, and she would find the humans, or find out what happened to them, even if it meant stealing a ship and defying her father and leaving behind everything she had ever known. The next morning she went to the royal hangar dressed in travel clothes, and her father was in a council meeting and would not notice her absence for hours, and she chose the fastest scout ship and one small enough that she could pilot alone, and she loaded supplies and star charts and every piece of data she had collected about human space Storm and Ember knew something was happening because dragons always knew, and they followed her to the ship and climbed into the cargo bay that she had modified years ago to carry them, because sometimes a princess needed to fly with her dragons to places that starships could not land. Lucy found her doing final checks, and the old woman did not try to stop her, but instead handed her a data chip and said, "This has the coordinates that the last humans left, and the council does not know about it, because we kept it hidden, and Arya, you are the only one who cares enough to look." Arya hugged Lucy hard and promised to bring back answers, and Lucy touched her cheek gently and said, "Bring back hope, child, because hope is what humans gave us, and hope is what we need now." The ship lifted silently, and Arya engaged stealth systems that would hide her from palace sensors, and she plotted a course toward Earth because that was where the trail would begin, and Storm pressed his large head against her shoulder and hummed the deep sound that meant protection. And Ember chirped excitedly because the little dragon loved adventures. As Sylvanmere disappeared behind them, Arya felt fear and excitement mixing in her chest because she was flying toward answers that might break her heart, but staying silent while humans disappeared into nothing was not something a dragon rider could do. And she whispered to her dragons, "We will find them, and we will understand why." The stars stretched ahead, and the void waited, and Princess Arya of Sylvanmere pointed her ship toward Earth and toward whatever truth waited in the silence. The jump through hyperspace took 6 days, and Arya spent the time reviewing every file Lucy had given her, and learning about the last days of Earth, and what she found made her chest tight with emotions she could not name because the humans had not panicked or fought or begged for help from the Council, but instead had worked together in perfect unity to build something impossible. Storm stayed close to her pilot chair and watched the star maps with intelligent eyes, and Ember curled in her lap like a cat, even though the dragon was the size of a large dog. And sometimes Arya would read aloud from human books, and both dragons would listen like they understood every word. The files showed that Earth had been dying slowly for 200 years, and the sun was growing hotter, and the planet was becoming uninhabitable, and humans had asked the Council for permission to settle other worlds, but the Council had refused because humans had rejected Council law and would not submit to galactic authority. So humans had built their own ships and settled their own colonies without permission, and the Council had threatened sanctions and blockades, but humans had simply smiled and continued building because that was what humans did when someone said they could not survive, but the colonies were not enough. And Earth was still home to 12 billion humans, and they could not all leave, and the Council would not help, and other species watched and did nothing, because humans were proud and difficult and refused to follow rules that other species accepted. Then something changed, and the files showed a discovery that human scientists made in the deep space beyond the galactic rim, and they found evidence of pathways through the void and places where reality was thin, and they theorized that a fleet could punch through the barrier if they had enough power and enough courage and enough desperation. The Council said it was suicide, and the void beyond the galaxy was where old things slept and where physics broke down and where no ship had ever returned from. But humans looked at their dying world and their 12 billion people and made a choice that no other species would make. They would take everyone and everything and sail into the dark together, because dying as one people in the unknown was better than slow extinction under a council that did not care. Arya watched videos of the preparation and saw humans building massive generation ships and arc vessels and transport carriers, and every human contributed, and the rich gave their wealth and the poor gave their labor, and children drew pictures for the ship's walls, and old people recorded stories for the journey. They took seeds from every plant and DNA from every animal and copies of every book and song and painting, because if they were sailing into forever, they would take Earth with them in every way that mattered. The launch date was set, and humans sent one final message to the galaxy, and Arya played it on her ship's speakers, and Storm's eyes glowed with understanding, as a human woman with gray hair and kind eyes spoke to the stars. "We are humanity, and we are leaving, and we do not go in anger or in fear, but in hope, because the universe is vast and full of wonders, and we refuse to believe that this galaxy is all there is, and we refuse to accept that death is the only ending, and we refuse to stay silent in the face of the impossible. The Council will call this suicide, and other species will call this madness, but we call this choice because we choose the stars over safety and the unknown over surrender, and we choose to face the dark together rather than die alone in the light. We leave this message for any species brave enough to understand, and if you ever wonder what happened to the humans, remember this, and we did not run away, and we ran toward." The transmission ended, and Ember made a sound like crying, and Storm roared softly in respect because dragons understood. Courage in humans had shown courage that even dragons could admire. Arya's ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system, and immediately alarm screamed because the sun was wrong, and it burned too hot and too bright, and the inner planets were blackened husks and only Earth remained barely habitable in the Goldilocks zone that was rapidly shrinking. She flew past Mars and saw the abandoned colonies with domes that still held air, but no people, and past the moon where human cities stood empty but intact, and then Earth filled her view screen and her breath caught because it was still beautiful. Blue oceans and green continents and white clouds, and it looked peaceful and alive. But her scanners showed the truth, and the temperature was rising and the ice caps were melting, and in another 50 years, Earth would be as dead as Venus. Area entered atmosphere over what her database called North America, and Storm and Ember pressed against the viewports and watched with wide eyes as they descended because neither dragon had seen Earth before, and they were curious about the world that had produced the species that impressed even them. The clouds tasted of salt and smoke, and Ember whimpered at the strange sense, and Arya flew low over empty highways and abandoned cities and farmland that was slowly returning to wilderness, because without humans to tend it, nature was reclaiming what was hers. She landed in a city called Denver, because her scanners showed power signatures in the deep underground, and Storm and Ember launched from the cargo bay the moment the doors opened, and they circled the ship twice before landing beside her with protective stances. The city was silent and clean and undamaged, and it looked like everyone had simply vanished between one moment and the next, because cars sat in parking lots and shops had goods still on shelves and restaurants had tables set for meals that would never be eaten. Arya walked through empty streets with both dragons following, and her footsteps echoed in the silence, and she felt like she was walking through a tomb. But it was not a sad tomb because there was something peaceful about it. Like Earth was resting after her children left in the center of the city, she found a plaza, and in that plaza stood a monument of white stone, and carved on it in 100 languages were the words, "We chose the stars over survival." And beneath that were coordinates and a date from 1 month ago. Arya traced the letters with shaking fingers, and Storm read the coordinates and rumbled low, because they pointed not in toward the galaxy but out toward the dark void. And Ember pressed close to Arya and chirped softly, because even the brave little dragon could feel the weight of what humans had done. Princess Arya stood before the monument and understood that she had not come to save humans, but to witness their choice, and to carry their message back to a galaxy that needed to hear it. Arya stood in the plaza for a long time and let the weight of human choice settle into her bones, because around her was proof that an entire species had looked at extinction and chosen dignity over desperation, and Storm sat beside her like a golden statue, and Ember explored the empty buildings with curious sniffs, and neither dragon seemed afraid of the ghost city. The coordinates on the monument matched the ones Lucy had given her, but there was more information here, and Arya pulled out her scanner and recorded every symbol and every message, because the monument was covered in human handwriting and drawings, and each person who had prepared to leave had written something for whoever came after. Some messages were simple and, "We lived here and we loved here and we hope you remember us," and some were complex and mathematical formulas and star charts and technical data about the barrier crossing, and some were just names and thousands of names, and every person who had taken the journey into the void. Arya read them until her eyes burned, and Ember returned with something in her mouth and dropped it at Arya's feet, and it was a stuffed toy bear and worn from being loved by some human child who had taken it on the journey to the stars. She picked it up gently, and Storm sniffed it and made a deep sound of understanding, because dragons could sense emotional residue, and this toy had been loved fiercely, and Arya tucked it into her pack, because it felt wrong to leave it behind. Her scanner chirped with a new reading, and she followed the signal to a building that her database identified as a library, and the doors were unlocked, and inside was power and lights and rows of books that humans had left behind, because they could not take the paper but had digitized the contents. But more importantly, her scanner showed life signs, and they were faint and deep underground, and Arya ran toward the source with both dragons bounding after her, and they found stairs that led down and down into bunkers that had been built to survive anything. The bunker door was sealed but not locked, and Storm used his strength to pull it open, and stale air rushed out, and then Arya heard it, and a cough and a weak voice, calling out, "Is someone there?" Inside the bunker were 47 humans, and they were old and sick and too weak to have made the journey, and they had volunteered to stay behind as Earth's final witnesses, and they had been living on stored supplies, and waiting for someone to find them. An old woman struggled to sit up, and she had kind eyes and silver hair, and she smiled at Arya with genuine joy and said, "We hoped someone would come, and you are not human, but you came anyway, and that means something." Arya knelt beside her and asked her name, and the woman said, "I am Betty, and I was a teacher before, and now I am a keeper of stories, and these others with me are the last voices of Earth." The other humans gathered close, and some walked with canes, and some were in wheelchairs, and some were too weak to stand. But all of them had clear eyes and strong voices, and they wanted to tell their story before they died. Betty explained that when humanity planned the great journey, they knew some could not survive the trip, and the crossing would be hard, and the void was dangerous, and those who were already sick or old would not make it. So these 47 had volunteered to stay, and to wait, and to tell anyone who came looking what had really happened, because they feared the galaxy would twist the story and call it cowardice or madness instead of courage. Storm and Ember moved among the humans gently and let themselves be touched and petted, because dragons understood honor, and these humans had chosen a hard death so their people could have hope. Betty showed Arya recordings that the departing humans had left, and Arya watched on old view screens as massive ships gathered in orbit, and 12 billion people boarded with their families and their pets and everything they could carry. The launch was coordinated perfectly, and every ship activated their drives at the same moment, and they punched through reality itself, and the barrier between the galaxy and the void beyond, and the light from their passage lit up Earth's sky like a second sun. Betty had tears on her face as she described watching from underground and knowing she would never see her children or grandchildren again, but feeling proud instead of sad because they were going somewhere new and somewhere free. Arya asked why they had really left and why take such an impossible risk. And an old man named George answered, "Because the council wanted us to bow and we do not bow, and they wanted us to follow rules that made no sense, and humans do not follow rules that make no sense." Another woman named Claire added, "We asked for help, and they refused, and we asked for permission, and they denied us, and we asked for basic decency, and they ignored us, and so we decided we did not need them." Betty nodded and said, "Humans learned long ago that waiting for someone else to save you means dying slow and taking action. Even dangerous action means living on your own terms. And we chose to live." Arya spent 3 days with the last humans, and she recorded everything they told her. And Storm and Ember stayed close and brought the humans water and food and comfort, because that was what dragons did for those who earned their respect. The humans told stories of Earth, history, and human culture, and why humans valued freedom over safety, and why they believed the impossible was just the not yet accomplished, and they showed her music and art and literature that explained humanity better than any report on the third night. Betty grew very weak, and she held Arya's hand and said, "Promise me something, child, and promise that you will tell the galaxy what we really did, and do not let them say we ran away, because we ran toward." Arya promised, and Betty smiled and closed her eyes and passed peacefully with Storm humming the dragon song for honored dead, and Ember curled beside her like a guardian. One by one, over the next week, the other humans followed, and each one died peacefully, and each one made Arya promise to tell the truth and to make sure humanity was remembered correctly. She buried them in the plaza beside the monument, and carved their names into the stone below the others, and Storm and Ember helped dig the graves, because even dragons understood that some things required ceremony. The last human was George, and before he died, he gave Arya a data chip and said, "This has everything, and the coordinates, and the science, and the reasons, and the hope." And he smiled and said, "Maybe someday someone will be brave enough to follow." Arya stood alone in the empty city with her 2 dragons, and she felt the weight of 47 promises and 12 billion dreams, and she knew what she had to do, even though it terrified her. Arya returned to her ship and uploaded all the data George had given her, and what she saw made her hands shake, because the humans had not just sailed blindly into the void, but had discovered something that changed everything. And they had found proof that the dark space beyond the galaxy was not empty, but full of pathways to other realities and other universes entirely. The science was complex, but the conclusion was simple, and humans had theorized that the galactic barrier was not a wall, but a membrane, and with enough energy a fleet could punch through into a space where physics worked differently and where dying stars did not matter. because there were infinite stars beyond. It was insane and beautiful and perfectly human, because no other species would risk everything on a theory. But humans had looked at certain death and possible survival, and chosen possibility. Every time, Storm read the data over her shoulder and rumbled thoughtfully, and Ember chirped with excitement, because the little dragon understood adventure, and this was the greatest adventure anyone had ever attempted. Aria sat in her pilot chair and thought about her options, because she could return to Sylvanmere and report what she found and let the council decide what to do with the information. Or she could do what every part of her soul was screaming at her to do. She activated her communication system and recorded a message to her father and to the council and to anyone who would listen. Hem Princess Aria of Sylvanmere. And I have found Earth, and I have spoken with the last humans, and I have learned the truth of what they did, and they did not flee in fear, and they did not surrender to death, and they chose to face the impossible, together, because that is what humans do. The council refused them help and denied them hope and forced them to find their own way. And they did, and they discovered a path that no one else dared to take, and they took 12 billion people and sailed into the dark void beyond our galaxy. I have their coordinates and their science and their reasons, and I am sending all of this data to you now. And the galaxy needs to know that humanity did not end, but transformed, and they are out there somewhere, becoming something new, and I am going after them because someone needs to witness what they become. And someone needs to be brave enough to follow where they led, and if I do not return, then know that I chose this, and my dragons chose this, and we go in hope not fear. She ended the transmission and sent it with all the data and coordinates, and then she locked out her ship's communication system so her father could not order her to return, because she knew he would try. Storm pressed his great head against her shoulder, and she felt his approval through their bond, and Ember launched herself into Aria's lap and licked her face with a warm tongue. And both dragons were telling her the same thing, and they would follow her anywhere. Aria plotted a course to the coordinates humanity had left, and the navigation system screamed warnings because the destination was beyond the galactic rim and in space that was marked as forbidden by every species, and her ship's computer kept asking her to confirm because surely this was an error. She confirmed, and Storm roared his challenge to the void, and Ember sang a high clear note that sounded like joy, and the ship jumped into hyperspace, heading toward the edge of everything known. The journey took 12 days, and each day they traveled farther from civilization and deeper into empty space. And the stars grew sparse, and the darkness grew thick, and Aria felt fear and excitement mixing in equal measure. She reviewed the human data constantly, and learned about their ships and their preparation and their hopes, and one file was a video message addressed to whoever comes after, and it was from a young human girl maybe 10 years old. The girl smiled at the camera and said, "My name is Katie, and I am going to the new place with my family, and if you are watching this, it means you were brave enough to follow, and thank you for caring about us. And maybe we will meet someday in the Stars Beyond Stars area." Watch that video a dozen times, and each time she felt more certain that she was doing the right thing, because Katie and 12 billion others deserve to have someone witness their courage. On the 10th day, her sensors detected something strange, and space itself felt different and thicker and harder to move through, and her ship slowed even though the engines were at full power because they were approaching the barrier. Storm felt it too and growled uneasily, and Ember pressed close to Aria and whimpered because dragons were sensitive to reality distortions, and the barrier was a massive distortion that separated the galaxy from whatever lay beyond. Aria brought the ship to a stop at what her sensors said was the edge, and ahead was nothing, and not the nothing of empty space, but the nothing of absolute void, and no light escaped it, and no sensor could penetrate it, and looking at it made her eyes hurt. She reviewed the human calculations, and they had theorized that a single ship could not generate enough power to breach the barrier, but a fleet working together could, and humanity had used all their ships at once to punch through. But Aria had only one small scout ship and 2 dragons, and it should not be enough, except that dragons were not normal creatures, and they were beings of pure energy wrapped in flesh, and bonded dragons could share power with their riders. She spoke to Storm and Ember through their bond and asked if they would help her, and both dragons responded instantly with fierce agreement. because they were hers and she was theirs, and they would burn themselves out before they let her face. This alone. Arya landed the ship on a dead planetoid at the barrier edge, and she and both dragons went outside in environment suits, and she began modifying the ship's power core because if they were going to do this, they needed to do it right. Storm and Ember could channel their energy through the bond and into the ship, and if Arya timed it perfectly, and if the human calculations were correct, and if they were lucky, then maybe they could generate enough power for one small ship to slip through. It took 3 days to make the modifications and test the connections and prepare for what might be a one-way trip, because the humans had not left instructions for coming back, only for going forward. On the morning of the 4th day, Arya stood with her dragons and looked at the barrier, and she felt no fear, only determination, because she was a dragon rider, and dragon riders flew toward danger. Not away from it, Storm and Ember pressed close, and she felt their love and loyalty through the bond, and she knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. She spoke the traditional dragon rider words that her people used before dangerous flights, and may our wings never falter, and may our fire never dim, and may our courage light the way for those who follow. They returned to the ship, and Arya took her position at the helm, and both dragons pressed their claws to the power conduit she had modified, and she felt their energy flowing through the bond and into the ship. The power core blazed with light that was gold and bright and impossible, and her ship lifted off the planetoid and turned toward the barrier, and Arya pushed the throttle forward, and they accelerated toward the void. The moment the ship touched the barrier, reality screamed, and Arya felt like she was being torn apart and put back together, and Storm roared in pain and Ember shrieked, and all three of them poured everything they had into keeping the ship intact. As it pushed through the membrane between universes, colors that had no names flashed past the viewports, and sounds that should not exist in vacuum echoed through the hull, and time felt wrong, like seconds were hours, and hours were seconds, and Arya could not tell if they had been crossing for moments or years. Then suddenly they were through, and the ship tumbled into normal space, and alarms were screaming, and the power core was overheating, and Storm and Ember collapsed on the deck, panting and smoking, and Arya fought to stabilize the ship before they crashed into something. She got control and cut the engines and let momentum carry them while she checked on her dragons, and both were alive but exhausted, and their scales were dim, and they needed rest and food and time to recover from the massive energy drain. Arya looked out the viewport and gasped, because the space beyond the barrier was not empty and not dark, and instead, it was full of colors and nebulas and stars that burned in shades she had never seen, and some were blue and some were purple and some were colors that her eyes could not quite process. Her sensors came back online and immediately detected something impossible, and there were ships and thousands of ships, and they were human ships, and they were in formation, and they were alive with power and movement. Arya followed the fleet signature and jumped toward them, and when she dropped out of hyperspace, she found herself looking at something that stole her breath and made her heart sing with joy. Humanity had not died, and they had not scattered, and they had not failed, because ahead of her was a fleet of 12,000 ships, and they were orbiting a planet that glowed with blue and green, and it was Earth, but not Earth because it was better. This world had oceans and forests and mountains and cities being built, and billions of humans were already on the surface, and the ships in orbit were construction vessels and science ships and explorers heading out to map this new universe. Arya's communication system came alive with transmissions and human voices speaking in excited tones, and ships were launching and drones were flying, and the whole fleet was buzzing with activity and life, and hope. A voice came through on her channel. "And this is Commander Helen Chen of the human fleet, and you are in restricted space, and please identify yourself immediately." Arya activated her transmitter with shaking hands and said, "I am Princess Arya of Sylvanmere, and I came from the old galaxy, and I met the last humans on Earth, and they asked me to follow. And so I did." There was silence for a long moment, and then Helen's voice came back, different and softer and filled with emotion. "And you met the 47 and the ones who stayed behind?" Arya felt tears on her face and said yes, and they died peacefully, and they told me everything, and they made me promise to tell the galaxy the truth. Helen was quiet again, and then said, "Come to the flagship, and we will bring you in, and there are people here who want to meet you and who want to thank you for caring enough to follow." The human ships guided Arya's scout vessel to a massive carrier, and she landed in a bay that was clean and organized, and When the doors opened, she saw humans and dozens of humans waiting, and they looked healthy and happy and very much alive. Storm and Ember walked beside her down the ramp, and the humans gasped at the dragons but did not run, and instead they bowed, respectfully because humans understood what dragons meant. Commander Chen was a tall woman with kind eyes, and she shook Arya's hand firmly and said, "Welcome to New Earth, and welcome to the future that humans built. And thank you for believing in us, when no one else did." Arya was led through the ship, and everywhere she looked, she saw humans working and laughing and building and creating, and children ran through corridors, and old people told stories, and artists painted murals on walls, and it was chaos and beautiful and so perfectly human. They brought her to a conference room, and there she met the human leadership and scientists and historians, and they listened as she told them about the 47 and about Earth and about the galaxy, that still did not understand what humanity had accomplished. An old scientist named Dr. Patricia Cole smiled with tears in her eyes and said the 47 were heroes, and they gave us time to cross safely, and they gave us the chance to send our message, and we honor them every day. Arya gave them the data chip George had left, and the recordings and the messages and the stuffed bear that Ember had found, and Patricia held the bear gently and said this belonged to my granddaughter, and she must have left it behind, and thank you for bringing it here. The humans asked about the galaxy and about other species and about whether anyone else would follow, and Arya told them about her message and about how she hoped others would be brave enough but did not know if they would. Helen looked thoughtful and said, "We left coordinates and clues because we wanted others to follow if they chose, and we do not want to be alone out here, and we want to share what we found." Patricia explained that this universe was different and larger and younger and full of worlds that could support life, and humanity was already exploring and mapping and finding wonders, and they had plans to build new colonies and new cities and maybe even contact whatever other civilizations existed here. But they also wanted to maintain contact with the old galaxy, and wanted to prove that crossing the barrier was possible, and wanted to invite others who were brave enough to join them. Arya stayed with the humans for 2 weeks, and Storm and Ember recovered and played with human children who were delighted by dragons. And she learned about New Earth, and about human plans, and about the civilization they were building on the day she prepared to leave. Helen gave her updated coordinates and new data, and better calculations for crossing back through the barrier. And Patricia gave her a message to take to the galaxy. The message was simple, and we are humanity, and we are alive, and we are thriving, and we invite any species who values freedom and courage and hope to follow us into the new universe, and we will welcome them with open arms. Arya stood on her ship with her dragons and looked back at New Earth one last time, and she saw a planet full of life and potential, and she knew that humanity had not ended but had instead begun something greater. She pointed her ship toward the barrier, and Storm and Ember channeled their energy, and they crossed back into the old galaxy with proof that the impossible was possible, and with hope that others would follow. When she arrived at Sylvanmere, her father was furious and relieved and proud and confused, and the council demanded answers and explanations, and Arya gave them everything. She stood before the assembled species and showed them New Earth and played the human messages, and explained that humanity had not fled, but had pioneered, and that the door was open for anyone brave enough to walk through. Some species called her crazy, and some called the humans reckless, and some said it was all a trick. But others, and especially the young ones and the dreamers, looked at the stars with new eyes and wondered what lay beyond. Princess Arya of Sylvanmere became known as the Dragon, rider who followed, and her story spread across the galaxy. And slowly others began to prepare for their own journeys, because humanity had proven that death was not the only ending. And on New Earth, humans watched the stars and waited, and hoped that someday others would join them in the beautiful impossible darkness where courage lived.